The invasion also could have been to spread democracy into the Arab world, and indeed a successful democracy was installed in Iraq. George W. Bush also claimed that he had divine inspiration to invade as part of a fight against what he called Gog and Magog. It could have been, as was said at the time, due to a hunt for weapons of mass destruction. Now, of course, none were found, but only because the Iraqi government destroyed them before the invasion. The Iraqi government had contacted the American government before the invasion, begging to avoid the war, but the Americans simply wouldn't listen. They had, at one stage, definitely have had weapons of mass destruction, without doubt, because they used them against the Kurds, remember. But they had destroyed them before the invasion in panic, in an effort to avoid the American war. For by then, however, it was simply too late. There was no avoiding it. Now, of course, the Iraqi government had for years been defying United Nations inspections and the American government. They had gained a lot of prestige in the local area by thumbing their noses at the American government. Famously, of course, Saddam Hussein made visitors who came to see him walk over the face of American images of the American presidents, and their power in the Arab world had come from the fact they'd been seen to stand up to American and United Nations interference. And so when it came to weapons inspections, they often said, oh, yes, you can inspect weapons of mass destruction, but don't look here, 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 or here, which always makes you suspicious that the areas you're not allowed to search are where they've hidden the weapons of mass destruction. But of course, as it turns out, they actually had already destroyed them by the time the British and Americans invaded. But you can understand that there was at least grounds to doubt that. And so you've got a number of potential reasons for why the invasion occurred. But wherever it occurred, then the Iraqi army, which had been, in terms of its size, huge, far bigger than the British army, actually, in terms of numbers of men. The Iraqi army, which had been a regionally dominant force, was rapidly beaten, and the business of state building, as it's called, could begin. And the American army would leave in 2011. But we're going to return to Iraq soon, and we're going to have a detour to have a look at the background of Syria before we can then take the history of these two countries forward. Now, in 1970, in Syria, then Bashar's father took power in a coup. In 1982, there was a Sunni uprising led by what's known as the Muslim Brotherhood, but that was crushed with 30,000 people dead. In the year 2000, Bashar al-Assad became president, head of the Ba'athist party. He was elected, but it has to also be said that nobody else was allowed to stand in these elections, but he did have the critical support of the army. In 2001, he arrested all of those calling for more democracy in the country, claiming that they were jihadists. From 2010 to 2011, as we start to merge the history of Syria with that of Iraq, there was the Arab Spring. Pro-democratic movements appeared across the Arab world, including in Syria. American troops at this time leave Iraq, leaving the democratically elected Iraqi government locked into an anti-insurgency war. On the 15th of March 2011, protests in Syria called for democracy and a release of political prisoners. The army fired into the crowd. A 13-year-old was captured, tortured, and killed. Protests after this called for an end to the Assad regime across 20 cities. In the struggles, 1,000 civilians and 150 soldiers were killed. On the 4th of June, the Syrian secret police ordered the army to fire into the crowd to restore order. Those soldiers that refused were to be executed. Some army units defected entirely and joined the protesters. The civil war in Syria had begun with the army refusing to fire into the crowd. The civil war against Assad was to be led by a group of army officers, and they became known as the Free Syrian Army, the FSA. In April 2012, the United Nations ordered a ceasefire, but it soon broke down In May 2012, there was what's known as the Hola Massacre. 108 civilians were killed, probably, but not definitely, by Assad's regime. Assad's regime, it must be said, claims that it was done by Islamic extremists, and so the civil war had resumed. Assad vowed to crush the rebels, but the FSA advanced everywhere across Syria. In the north, the Kurds had risen up again for independence, and in the east, especially along the borders of Iraq, Islamic extremist forces also rose up in what was going to be a multi-sided civil war. In January 2013, the violence in Iraq worsened in the fighting between Islamic extremists and the democratically elected Iraqi government. At least 500 Islamic extremists were freed from jail in Iraq in a military-style assault upon the prison. At first, Al-Qaeda led the fight in there, but it was soon replaced by IS or Daesh due to their successes on social media and the internet. They proved to be very good at exploiting violence to win recruits. In Syria, IS took Idlib in the north, while Kurdish troops clashed with the FSA near the city of Raqqa. After the two sides were exhausted, after the Kurds and the FSA had exhausted each other militarily, IS took control of the city of Raqqa. In April 2013, Assad, now supported by Russia, Iran and Hezbollah, a Jordanian militia force, started to halt the FSA, with both sides suffering huge losses in the fighting. In August 2013, the FSA tried to stamp out IS or Daesh. They increasingly are called Daesh because IS hate the name Daesh. It's very similar to Deus, one who sows dissent. It sounds a bit like Daesh, sinner, and Janish, which means stupid ass, which is why people in the West are so keen to call them Daesh. The Arab countries increasingly started to support different factions within the FSA, which of course also so did the British and Americans. On the 21st of August 2013, Assad used sarin gas in Damascus against the FSA. Assad, however, his government denies that he used sarin gas against the FSA and claims that the FSA used sarin gas against themselves. Led by chemical weapons, however, the government started to drive the FSA back. In January 2014, the FSA, now supported by Turkish airstrikes, drove IS or Daesh out of Aleppo, killing Daesh's second in command, and started to fight in Raqqa. In Iraq, new elections were called, but this had a disastrous consequence. The army that had been more or less on top of the fight against IS went home because Iraq was not yet used to democracy, and of course when elections were called there were no governments, and so the Iraqi army didn't know who they were fighting for, who to obey their orders. They went back to barracks, parked their equipment, and went to vote and to go home and await the formation of a new government. And in the absence of the Iraqi army's efforts, IS or Daesh seized huge swathes of northern Iraq. In February 2014, Assad's new offensive retook Homs and the old Crusader castle of Crac de Chevalier, but IS was their campaign against IS halted briefly after an exchange of fire with Israel, as a new nation got involved in the blood-soaked chaos that Syria had become.